So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank Branislav and Jeremy, especially for coming very early for Branislav Saturday morning, not so early for Jeremy in Berlin. I was going to introduce the speakers, but I did some research on how to be a great moderator, and everyone said, give them each 30 seconds to introduce themselves because you'll get something wrong. But given their CVs, I'm going to give them each 35 seconds because long. So would you like to each introduce yourself, please?
Okay, I'll go first since my name starts with a B. My name is Branislav Slantchev. I'm a professor of international relations, political science at the University of California, San Diego. I've been here for basically since the start of my career, so for 22 years. And I specialize actually in international conflict, and my primary focus is on war termination, crisis negotiations, and things like this. I actually do mostly mathematical modeling of things like this, but that's my area of expertise.
I'm Jeremy Shapiro. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all 35 seconds, but I'm the research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at Brookings and a SAIS graduate with a lot of you. So it's good to see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm sort of looking forward to catching up over the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. So the format that our guests requested, and we all agreed to, is a series of open-ended questions, basic questions, and I have a few that we're going to start with, but ultimately this is a conversation, so everyone's going to be able to participate, ask questions, and have a dialogue with our guests. So I'm going to break off with the very first question, which is, what would a negotiated settlement look like in this conflict? Branislav.
So it's actually a great day to discuss this because there seem to be some developments here from yesterday that indicate that we're moving into a new stage in this conflict. I remain skeptical, but to answer this question, you need to ask yourself what the goals of the Russians really were and what kind of things the Ukrainians might possibly be conceding, right, in this kind of conflict. So very quickly, I just want to some of the ideas that are circulating, I think, are non-starters for basically because they're meaningless for the Russians, despite sounding very good, and some are non-starters for the Ukrainians. So let me just say, my view of the conflict is that Putin's goals in Ukraine are essentially unlimited. This idea that somehow a possible membership of Ukraine in NATO or the European Union triggered this, I think is mistaken. I think it's just a pretext, simply because, I mean, we can go into this. I'm very happy to explain why. This is a very popular theory, especially, I mean, even among some of my colleagues, but I do not think it's correct. Given this, I think it's clear that his original intent was to topple the government very quickly. He expected to be done in a few days, install a pro-Russian regime there of some sort. By topple the government, I mean not taking Kiev militarily, actually. I think they hope that the government would just fold and run, and it would look very good for Putin because it would support his theory that these guys are just Western-installed puppets. Of course, that did not work, and they got bogged down. So Putin then switched to his other strategy, which is attrition. And he's been trying to essentially destroy some of the cities in the south. We can talk about why that might be the case, but essentially he's targeting civilians for the most part because they can't really defeat decisively the Ukrainian military with the forces they've committed, and they're hoping that this will bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. The only problem with this has been that the Russian demands have remained essentially the same since the beginning. They have not moderated. until yesterday that there seems to be some kind of movement. So I've always said since the beginning, the prospect of a negotiated settlement to this with Putin in office is very, very low. And I was, because the demands that they make on Ukraine, yeah, sure. I mean, the Ukrainians can say, we're going to promise not to join NATO, all this stuff, but that's not relevant. What they really, if you read one of the demands that they're making is demilitarization, which essentially means the Ukrainians have to disband their army or have some token army of 20,000 or 40,000. No Ukrainian government is going to agree to this, even before the invasion, let alone after the invasion. Now the Poles are proposing peacekeeping forces. This cannot come in until the Russians actually are defeated, frankly, on the field. What are they going to do there? How are they going to protect anybody? So the demands remain unlimited. So every time they said there's movement in the negotiations, you can see the Ukrainian delegation basically said, oh, the Russians are realizing what the realities on the ground are. And the Russians were saying, oh, the Ukrainians are finally realizing that they need to, make these concessions. So you could not see one position from the other one with a telescope, frankly. So the development yesterday was that the Russians are signaling that they declared that the first phase of the operations has concluded successfully and that they have degraded the Ukrainian military sufficiently. And now they're focusing on liberating Donbass. So to translate this from Kremlin speak, they got severely bruised by the Ukrainians. They basically, part of their army is about to be encircled to the east of Kyiv. They got pushed back in the south, even where their offensive was going relatively well in the beginning. The Ukrainians have now entered and are attempting to liberate Kherson. If they do this, they will break the siege of Mariupol. So the Russians are actually doing very badly. So what they're doing now is they're focusing their attempts to the east of the Dnieper River in an attempt to encircle the Ukrainian forces there. So I think, and this has been actually my view from this conflict back in 2014 when I said that it's inevitable that Russia will invade Ukraine, given the policies that are being pursued. I thought that the invasion would be limited to East Ukraine, and they're trying to, since they cannot control the western part, they're going to dismember the country. So now they seem to be doing precisely this. They're trying to organize sham referenda in the areas under their control, so they can claim that there's drive for independence from Ukraine, like they did in Crimea. And they're sending reinforcements from Georgia and from probably Armenia that have been stationed there to basically stem this terrible losses that the Ukrainians are inflicting on them. They cannot turn the war with these kind of reinforcements. April 1st is soon. This is the new conscripts are going to get into the army. We'll see what happens there in Russia. But the way this is happening right now, it seems that they may have decided to try to detach eastern Ukraine, which means negotiated peace is unlikely because the government in Kyiv would not allow this. So that's my short on this. I am happy to elaborate on why I think these.
That was the short version. Huh? Okay.
That is the short version. I said that's why you need questions. If you let me talk, I'll talk for hours.
Yeah,
I'm used to captive audiences. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. They look captivated. I think that I guess I can start by agreeing that I think that a negotiated settlement is unlikely. Frankly, that's always a good prediction in wartime. But I think it's a particularly good prediction right now. I would, without really disagreeing though, I would sort of frame it in a different way, because I think that any negotiated settlement is an interaction between two sides, really. And the Russians are only half the equation, and I'm not sure the most difficult half in terms of a negotiated settlement. For all the reasons that we just heard, the Russians have an interest in at least a negotiated pause, which is something that Russians do a lot. The Ukrainians are the ones that have less of an interest in it at the moment and seem less inclined to it for exactly the reasons that were explored, because the momentum is toward them. And so I think actually that should bring into relief the the role that the West is playing, because sometimes we say, well, the Ukrainians won't accept this, the Ukrainians won't accept that, the Ukrainians will keep fighting, or the Russians will keep fighting. In fact, the West is, practically a combatant in this conflict already, which is, a frightening concept, but it's nonetheless a Rubicon that's kind of already been crossed. I'm sure if you were sort of sitting there in a Kremlin meeting, they would basically be thinking about the West as an active participant in this war. And that means that the negotiated settlement will have a lot to do with us as well. And that means that we have, if we think a negotiated settlement, and I guess I do, would be greatly in the interests of the West, of Ukraine, and frankly of Russia, then it's probably something that we could push for, and that we will have to understand. And this is frankly something I've seen in our efforts to create negotiated settlements in all of these types of places that we very rarely understand, that we will have to coerce both sides into that settlement. We will, because at the end of the day, the reason what negotiated settlements are so hard to come up with in the middle of the war is that at any given moment, one side, at least one side, thinks they can win and therefore doesn't want the negotiated settlement. In this sense, hope is the enemy of peace in these things. And so you do have to sort of extinguish hope. I think that in terms of what it would look like, actually, it's not that difficult for me to imagine. I think that the Russian demands have actually changed quite a bit over the course of the conflict. And in any case, the Russians always open with maximalist demands and then, shave it down without claiming that they ever did. So it's not that hard for me to understand. And I wrote an entire book a couple of years ago with a bunch of colleagues at RAND about what a sort of European security architecture could look like. And it does involve some sort of neutralization by another name of Ukraine and similar countries, as well as some degree of Russian influence in Ukrainian politics. It doesn't, demilitarization is something that I think they have already relaxed. They have relaxed denazification, which is, I think, their word for regime change. So it's not that hard to see. And then I think the stickiest problem, frankly, is the Donbass and Crimea and their status. And I think there you'll probably get what they've often gotten in frozen conflicts, which is a sort of decision to ignore their status and to let the de facto status rule the day, without really being part of the settlement. I guess I think that the longer term issue is, of course, that a settlement might end this war, but probably would be a prelude to the next one, which could really be just a month or a few years later. And I think you see this sort of Russian pattern here, which is, in Chechnya, they did the sort of same thing, which is they lost the first war. They reached a settlement, they came back and then undid the settlement and won the second war. And that doesn't have to be over the course of a few years, it could be over the course of a few months. But I think that what we would need to be doing in following up on any settlement is really trying to figure out a true modus vivendi between the Russians and their neighborhood, which I think is something that we haven't really taken seriously in the past few decades. There is a view in the West that the best way to do that is to just sort of suck all of these countries into NATO and the European Union. And that probably would be where the tendency would be if there is a lull in this fighting. I'm not really sure that that's the best approach, but we can discuss that later if you want.
Sorry, I'm muted. So just to follow up on that, you both believe that a negotiated settlement is unlikely. Should the West be helping to build a golden bridge, or as Andrei Kozyrev says, is the golden bridge a big mistake, as in Russia only understands resolve, and maybe Ukraine is also only understands resolve? What are we going to do? What happens if we try to build a golden bridge? And how do we do it?
Well,
what's the golden bridge? Is that like peace? Or?
That's trying to figure out a way to roll back.
For Putin, right? If I understand it correctly.
Right, for Putin. So yes, trying to figure out an easy way for him to save face and to roll back what he's begun.
I will say first that I think we absolutely must not do any such thing. I'm on record since 2014. That's a huge mistake to deal with Putin as if he has some security concerns that we're going to be satisfying. Again, I'm happy to elaborate. I disagree here with Jeremy, but let's talk just about the off-ramp. Nobody can really predict the future, right? We can't really, I can't tell you this is going to work or not work, but can give you some arguments why I think it's a mistake. First of all, the world changed completely, I think, very fundamentally on February 24th. One of the things that are going to that is going to continue no matter how this war turns out is that the West will be hostile to Russia for decades. While Russia remains undemocratic, it's not going to go back to business. What I mean by this is that even if we relax some sanctions, business is not going to go back to Russia anytime soon. The actions that the Russians are taking right now is making it basically impossible for anybody to go back anytime soon. There's not going to be any political will to relax the sanctions. There's a lot of drive now to continue on this path, which I think is the correct one, frankly. So in kind of political science speak, the West cannot credibly commit to provide a golden bridge to Putin, even if we were inclined to do so, and I think we're not. The thing that happened, again, if you look at the past 20 years or so of history, one view is that, we provoked kind of the Russians. We expanded eastwards, NATO, the European Union, we encroached on their interest, we're meddling in their backyard. All this eventually provoked a response. I'm simplifying, but that's kind of the view of many people. That's why these talks about neutrality for Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. In reality, however, we did no such thing. You have, the statements by heads of the, generals in the Russian military who are telling you that the West represents no fundamental threat right now to Russia. Things are not the same as they were during the Cold War. And as a result, you have to think about the reasons for this, what happened here, in a different way. So attempting to give him these things that we think he needs is not going to stop it, basically, is my point. Putin simply wants to take Ukraine, not just Ukraine, for reasons that have nothing to do with security. Because he told you so. I mean, that's the part. I'm always flabbergasted with people.
He never said that.
Yeah, of course he did. There's no there's no Ukrainians. They're all Russians. Ukraine is an invented country.
That's the.
Really, I don't understand.
It's been a Russian view for decades that Ukraine is an invented country, but they haven't invaded it.
Yeah, we can actually talk about the timing. That's a separate issue. Why now and why? But the point is, I just wanted to say, I'm a little
bit concerned about this sort of view that you're sort of sleeping under Putin's bed, and you know what he thinks. I just don't know what Putin thinks.
I'm telling you.
I don't know what he mumbles in his sleep.
I did not say any such thing. I'm telling you, I'm reading what he's said for years, and given his action, I see no reason to not believe him.
He said he wants to take all of Ukraine. He's never said that.
Can I just finish my first thought? And I'm happy to discuss this and tell you about the philosophy that everybody think. Anyway, what we actually did over the past 20 years is we bent over backwards to accommodate this regime. We ignored everything he did essentially in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Africa, in Syria. The Europeans were happy being dependent on Russian resources, trading like crazy. He was crushing, whatever path for nascent democracy there. And we're like, okay, whatever. Again, we had no deep ideological struggle with them. There's no really, part of the problem is everybody treated Russia as a has-been power. So they're not really dangerous in a sense. So we just do business with them and ignore them. So rather than the stories like the West is encroaching on Russia, we're encircling them, we're crushing them. In fact, we were just letting them do whatever they wanted, frankly. And we were hostile in many ways, but in terms of his regime, they were profiting, they were trading. And exactly what kind of threat would the West represent to Russia? Actually, I would like somebody to explain to me what army is going to be invading them and for what purpose. So what security threat we represented. We did represent a threat. I'm just saying it's a different kind of threat. It's a threat for Ukraine to become democratic, to become tied to the West and all the stuff that really was is a threat to Putin, for sure. I'm not denying that. So given in this context, that we've allowed him to basically rule any way he wants, for the most part, the fact that he chooses to invade now should be telling you something. So, and what he's telling me is that he does have goals that he was not being able to fulfill. Like you mentioned, the situation in East Ukraine would be frozen conflict. But the fact is the situation in East Ukraine was failing. His strategy was failing there. Of all the, I think it was 3,500 civilians that died since 2014 there. The bulk of them, over 2,000, died in the first year of the conflict there. Over the past 3 years, they've averaged 25 civilian deaths. What was the
question again?
I'm just saying that this idea that there was a frozen conflict there.
No, I just mean we're wandering a bit far afield, and I'm getting a little bit lost. I think that the question at issue is there a sort of golden bridge for Putin?
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
Well, does the West want
being proposed as a golden bridge are unlikely to work unless he's squeezed so far that he cannot hope to accomplish his goals with the military, which, don't forget, 85 to 90% of the Russian military is still intact. I mean, this idea that the Ukrainians are crushing it is great, but it's not quite there. He does have reserves. So I'm saying the golden parachute is not going to work because what I think his aims are. Let me just...
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. Well, maybe not because of what his aims are, but I don't think that it's for the West to, or is capable or willing to provide a golden bridge or golden parachute or golden something. And I don't think that, at the end of the day, the Russian regime or Vladimir Putin really needs one because, it has a pretty impressive propaganda machine. It can build off ramps for itself out of thin air if it desires to. But I think that to me, the issue is really what we want to do and what we're willing to do. I think we can stipulate that, Vladimir Putin is an asshole and the Russian regime is aggressive and nasty. That's a pretty strong constant among Russian leaders and Russian regimes in history. So it's not anomalous, but it is a problem. So what are we going to do about it? We have, at the end of the day, we have sort of two fundamental choices. Either we can attempt to live with it or we can attempt to erase it. And I think we have already made the decision to attempt to live with it because erasing it is too difficult, because regime change in a country with several thousand nuclear weapons is too dangerous a proposition. So if we're going to live with it because of that, and I think we don't have much choice, then we have to think about how to reach agreements with it. We have succeeded at reaching agreements historically with a bunch of assholes, including Russian assholes. And the reason that we have succeeded at doing that is because we have been able to construct solutions at times, sometimes temporarily, but if you can do that for a decade or two, it's better than not, that reflect their interest and reflect ours. I do think that kind of thing is possible because I don't think that the history as was described is precisely right. I mean, I think the Russians have done a lot of horrible things in the last 20 years, but I also think that the West has did in fact push them quite hard. To me, it's quite interesting that, George Kennan in 1998 said, if we do this, the Russians will react. We did it, the Russians reacted. But now we say that's not the reason. I think there were other reasons. It's true. I was in the US government in the Obama administration, and we were trying to change their regime. So their threat assessment was correct. So I think we have to acknowledge that about ourselves. If we now lapse into this rhetoric about, well, we can't live with Vladimir Putin, we can't make a deal with Vladimir Putin because he's an asshole, again, stipulating that he's an asshole, then we have to understand that the alternative is an effort to change the regime in Russia somehow. And that is an extremely dangerous proposition, which I think all of the policymakers that have looked at it have thought is probably not the wise thing to do.
Wolfgang had a...
I'm actually, let me just add to this a little bit. I've always been puzzled by these attempts to change regimes in Russia. I don't know what you worked on, but it's frankly, I never quite understood what the thinking has been there, because I
can describe it for you if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I get the idea, but the idea that we somehow can actually do this has always been far-fetched to me. And
I didn't think it was I think from the perspective of the Russian government, the fact that we were trying was probably quite concerning.
Yeah, my point was, as I've been saying all along too, is that we shouldn't, because we can't. I mean, it's as simple as that. So yes, as I said, yes.
It leads me to my question. How likely would be a regime change within Russia itself? Is everybody happy within the military with the generals, which what's going on at the moment? Is there any hope for that? How realistic is that? And the other question is, you two experts, the question I want to put to you is, how serious is Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons?
I honestly cannot answer the first question, except to tell you that my opinion is very unlikely that there will be a regime change. I don't know. There's always a possibility that somebody will do something, but I think the likelihood is low. He has a pretty tight grip on the people around him. We can see he recently seems to have, some people have vanished from the public sphere that we're now wondering where they are.
Shoigu reappeared yesterday or today.
Which one? Shoigu? Was that? Are you talking on the link that even now
that he reappeared today? Yeah.
Yeah, and then Gerasimov is kind of unknown. So we don't know what's going on. That's the truth. I have no idea. But these guys around him, they're all dependent on him. And the problem with all of these palace coup scenarios is that, first of all, there's no public support, I think, in Russia for anything like this. He's enjoying quite a bit, as Jeremy said. His propaganda has been working wonders a lot, and he has support. Who's going to depose him, and then what are they going to do? Exactly. So the likelihood of them moving against him, I think we should forget this. I mean, if it happens, it happens, but we cannot possibly bank on this. That's my view.
Yeah, I can't add to that. I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's just that I think you kind of said this, but the thing about a palace coup is you never see it coming, because if you did, it wouldn't happen. So there is some small possibility of it that we've just totally missed, but I think we haven't seen it coming at all, and there is no indication of that in any way. On the nuclear question, it's not that I think we should take there is an element of the way that Putin treats nuclear weapons as trying to sort of play on the fears of the West in the way that I just expressed them in the last answer. And so there is a degree of bluff and bluster there. But at the same time, I think that we should take quite seriously the idea that if the Russians feel like they are backed into a corner in various ways, it's in their doctrine, if there's a sort of existential threat to the state, that they will use them, especially I think tactical nuclear weapons are significantly more likely than strategic nuclear weapons in the first instance. And I think what the places, I wrote a piece in the Financial Times on this a couple of weeks ago. And I think that the way that you would likely see it is less in Ukraine, because I don't think it's a sort of viable or even necessary weapon for them within Ukraine, but it would be to preempt or stop what they saw as a coming Russian intervention. I think it's very clear from the Russian General Staff that they view a NATO intervention as much more likely or possibly already happening than we do. And they are really nervous about the way they have sort of revealed their flank to NATO, and they are actually quite nervous about a NATO attack I know it's kind of difficult to conceive of, I think, because we're not intending to attack. And as a matter of fact, we're having debates about whether we can even station forces in Eastern Europe. But this is, I think, the way they see the world. And so to the degree that they think a NATO attack is coming or happening, I think that that's when they would use tactical nuclear weapons. And I think that would unleash escalation dynamics that we can't predict or control.
So some of the people who opposed Putin in January, the retired generals in particular, it was quite a vociferous opposition. It was actually written a little bit about it in the West, but it kind of fell by the wayside because at the time everybody thought, well, that's far-fetched. He's not going to attack Ukraine. In fact, they said that their expectation is that if he goes to war in Ukraine, NATO will attack. So what Jeremy's saying is exactly right. I think they know probably more about what NATO is doing than we do right now already. Because I don't have special contacts. I can go by the press, and I'm 100% positive we're doing a lot more than what the press is telling us. I mean, you can track the NATO warplanes on radar and see when they fly from Turkey, circle around Romania, and fly back, where all the intelligence is going and things like this. My biggest worry is that we now have a hot war in Europe, and essentially, in some sense, all bets are off. It's unpredictable, completely unpredictable. No world war ever started as a world war. They always started as just local affairs. And there's a huge chance that if the Russians seem to be backed into a corner or seem to be threatened, for instance, I'm very nervous if the Ukrainians encircle Russians and start pulverizing them, that this might be one way of their strategy of escalating to de-escalate, use some kind of attack. I'm sure hoping that they're restrained by the possible intervention by NATO, but given what we're saying, I'm not sure where our red line is. I'm not even sure NATO knows where the red line is. I'm sure they've gamed out a lot of scenarios, but I would not rule it out. I mean, in Russia, you need 2 people out of 3 to sign off on the use of nuclear weapons, if I understand their protocol correctly. That's Putin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov right now. One of them is gone. The other one, it's unclear whether he reappeared or not. I mean, he showed up on a video conference, but people who analyze the video claim that it's basically same stuff as from 10 days ago. So it's not clear where the guy is. And these are they're his cronies anyway. So I'm not sure what exactly restraint there is within the chain of command to escalate there. So I can't rule it out. We're living in much more dangerous times, I think, than people realize. The fact that the war has now taken on a scale that it has is telling you many things have changed. The willingness to do this is pretty indicative.
I want to go in a slightly different direction now. What does the conflict mean for global order? Jeremy, would you like to start?
Yeah, I just put that FT piece I mentioned in the chat, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it will have big effects on global order. In particular, I think that the main effect is, let's say, twofold. In the first instance, the Biden administration, I think, very in a rare way for an American administration, had a very, up until this war, it had a very focused foreign policy. They really had established priorities in foreign policy and had been sticking to them until, let's say, December-ish. And that was really a focus on Asia and China. And that focus reflected the fact that they felt that China was by far the biggest challenge, and that they had limited resources and that they needed to focus their resources and their attention there. This war has been a sort of complete collapse of that foreign policy focus. So obviously they've been much more focused on Russia in the last 2 or 3 months, but of course China hasn't remotely gone away. And I would argue, in fact, that the Chinese problem has, as a result of this war, gotten a lot worse, because the way in which Russia has been sort of radically decoupled to channel Gwyneth Paltrow. No, consciously decoupled. Excuse me, consciously decoupled. I've got to get my Paltrowese right. It's very hard. The way in which Russia has been consciously decoupled from the international economy will, I think, in the fairly short term, render them much more dependent on China, and has made basically, will, I think, in just a few years, probably make Russia kind of the heavily armed gas station of China. And that means that the US and its allies are now facing, I think, more of a sort of global two-front Cold War, if you could put it that way, in which they'll have to be, from a US perspective, they'll have to be thinking very hard about how to coordinate and allocate resources, time, and attention across the two theaters. And in particular, they'll have to think about how to make the Asian allies and the European allies work more as a whole. Currently, they don't really at all, and the US is sort of involved in two separate problems. I also think that well, I'll end there, I guess.
I agree actually with all of this. The relevant here, I think, also is what Jan Panek asked in the chat with the economic sanctions. I think they are an integral part of this, and they are likely to stay. And this is where I can't predict which way China will really go. On one hand, they will absolutely not abandon Russia or anything like this. So we're making these threats to the Chinese, but they have their interests there. I mean, unless this war escalates dramatically, they're the ones that stand to profit in many ways from it, for the reasons that Jeremy said, but also directly because it pushes Russia further and further into, turning into a vassal state of China, essentially, which is kind of ironic given the history of the Cold War itself. The relationship there is now reversed. The problem with the sanctions, for instance, is that they will have a devastating effect on the Russian economy. The Chinese will be limited in how much they can backstop this, because they still have, what, $2 trillion worth of trade with Europe and the United States, and what, 100 billion, 120 billion with Russia. So they have to also tread carefully there. They can't just openly go and support the Russians, but they will. So to the extent that they do, whether they will remain as two separate entities we deal with separately, or one united bloc, which is led now by China, that actually remains to be seen, right? I have absolutely no idea where China will go. There's domestic politics that are a bit complicated too. So for now, I think we do not have a solution to China at all. Even like, I can't even imagine what a theoretical solution there looks like. And now, of course, with our focus on Russia, that's going to makes compromises with the Chinese just to kind of keep them not quite on the other side of what appears to be the new Iron Curtain falling.
I mean, I guess I would just add that you can sort of see the Chinese approach to this problem emerging. They were a bit surprised by the war, I guess, like most of us, and they probably didn't want it because it's kind of not their style. But they can manage it. They have what a former White House official in China called a pro-Russian neutrality, which means that they will essentially attest to being neutral, but actually help the Russians enough to make sure that they sustain. So they can't and probably don't even want to make up for all of the losses that the sanctions are visiting upon the Russian. But they can sort of put them on a sufficient life support to render them both a viable concern for ever, and also quite dependent on them. And that's the sort of strategy that they've tended to adopt with a lot of countries. That's their strategy with North Korea, for example. So I think it's a viable strategy, and I think that gets to the sanctions point, which is that one of the things I learned in the government is, and it was a little bit of a surprise to me, that you can put sanctions on, but you really can't take them off. Basically, in order to take sanctions off, the regime has to change. And the reason for this is because it's not a government decision to take the sanctions off. I think people miss that a lot. The sanctions are implemented by banks and companies and private sector entities. And they won't remove the sanctions, even if the US government tells them to, as long as they think that they could come back. And so the US has it's interesting, in the Iran deal, for example, when they did the Iran deal in 2015 and reduced the sanctions on Iran, nothing happened in terms of economic activity with Iran. That's a slight exaggeration, but not much happened. And the reason was because the US wasn't able actually to remove the sanctions in that kind of calibrated way. So these sanctions are really staying fundamentally for as long as the current Russian regime is there. And that means that they will increasingly be dependent on China.
Which, just to add to this, has been my kind of, in a way, hope that the key to solving the problem is actually in Beijing right now. Because just like the Ukrainians dependent on us, so we can exercise some behind-the-scenes pressure on them to accept certain kinds of things, certainly China can do this if they're willing to. So one of the things that might restrain this war from escalating is that I don't think the Chinese really have an interest in this war escalating. So I don't know if they have any influence with Putin that they can kind of, behind the scenes. I'm not sure exactly what their relationship is like right now, but that's another reason to try to see if they can play some more constructive role there. But their regime is so opaque to some, even to specialists here that I talk to in these important ways, it's unclear. But that's, I think, you can hope that their economic interest is not in this escalating further. And if Russia is going to be as dependent on China as we expect it to be, they have to pay attention what the Chinese are telling them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, that's really very much the way the White House sees it. And they have been really attempting to sort of motivate the Chinese in this way. They've had no success, and it's such a strange relationship, the China-Russia one. It's like the world's worst marriage. You know, they can't get out of it, but they really don't seem to like each other. And they have this weird way of communicating where the Chinese will never tell the Russians what to do directly. They'll just, decrease the amount of oil that they're taking or something like that. They have a very sort of subtle, passive-aggressive manner of communicating with each other. And it's really contrary to everything that the Chinese think and do to mediate a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or to tell the Russians directly what to do. Even though I quite agree with you that that's precisely what they think and that's precisely what their interests are.
I mean, some of the stuff, I don't know what happened with this, but I think it was a week ago when the Russians went to China to get supplies for their airplanes, all the Boeings and the Airbuses that they can't really keep flying under the sanctions. The Chinese said no, so they went to India. So I'm not sure what the resolution of this has been. So they are sending some signals there that to establish the limits of this unlimited relationship that they announced. But I agree, the Chinese have never really mediated anything. That doesn't seem to be their style. They have no experience in this. They doesn't, again, and that's why this is a torture process. I'm actually not at all happy when the press here reports the administration's interactions with China, like we're threatening them with doing things if they intervene, because I'm not sure that is a good idea. I mean, the press, the Chinese controlled press in China is very kind of pro-Russian right now, the way they interpret this. So, yeah.
I have a follow-up question to the sanctions issue, but then I want to open it up to everyone. Sanctions are very often ineffectual, but in this situation, can we effectively starve Russia of finance and technology to the point where it makes a difference for Putin, or is Putin okay because he's insulated enough from the Russian population?
Are you asking if there will be like a popular revolt against him?
Well, in the extreme, yes, but does it matter what happens to the population in Russia?
Well, on a human scale, it does matter. I mean, I am unhappy that Russians are going to suffer because I mean, you can blame them for many things if you want to, but I mean, the reality is this is not an elected regime. They can't really remove him from power, short of some kind of popular uprising. A lot of them work in an informational, bubble that is very difficult to penetrate. They're motivated to stay in this bubble. I mean, part of the things that I think people don't realize, the reason the Russians believe that the Kremlin's version of the story is that many of them can't even imagine going there and shooting at Ukrainians. It makes no sense to them. So of course he's not doing it. So when he says he's not doing it, of course not, he's not doing it, and they're not going to believe anything you tell them otherwise. It's hard to convince them. So the problem with the sanctions is that they are working, ironically, in hurting the population. But the way this is going to be sold and interpreted is that, yeah, we told you the West is against you, and this is what they're doing. And we're taking measures to counter this, and we're doing the best we can. I can't see a popular revolt in Russia. Just don't see this. I mean, it's not like they're against him. They're with the regime in this.
Yeah, I mean, I would take that and make a more general point, which is that sanctions almost never can do that. Typically speaking, regimes, and that's really, by and large, not what they're intended to do. They're intended to sort of inflict punishment and make a statement. And I think these sanctions are definitely doing those two things. And definitely the Russian regime feels them and is unhappy about them. And that's why they're running around the world trying to break them in various ways. But the idea that they can so cripple the Russian economy or Russian politics to such an extent that they can't continue to prosecute the war, or that there is a popular revolution, I don't think we can point to an example like that in world history where sanctions have done that. I mean, I think the closest thing is South Africa, but I don't think it really does the chord. And the reasons are the ones that are generalized reasons of what was just said, that they actually sanctions tend to, in any country, create a sort of rally around the flag effect, because they can be blamed on the outsiders. They tend to reinforce the existing elites because they have greater control over the scarcer resources that are left. And they tend to cow the public, and so they don't actually create popular revolutions. And generally speaking, particularly if you have an outside supporter like China, like Russia does with China, the economy can continue to exist on sort of life support, roughly speaking, forever. So if you look at what's going on in North Korea, I mean, they've been under a massive sanctions regime since, roughly speaking, the beginning of time. It's a horrible place to live. They go through periods where people eat bark, but there's been no popular revolution. The regime is as solid in place as it ever is. It fired an intercontinental ballistic missile yesterday. Admittedly, it was made with chewing gum, but still, it's impressive. And their military machine continues to function, more or less. So I think that's a model for what you can expect.
Well, but the distinction is that Russia's had 20 years of enjoying US and Western technology, computers and software, the cloud, like the lifestyle.
That means that Russia's in a better position to sustain this stuff than North Korea.
I mean, they're going to do what they did under the Soviets. They're going to steal the technology they need. It's going to be crappy in 10, 15 years behind over time, but that's it. I mean, so what? Instead of needing a truck of electronics to service their airplanes, they'll just need a screwdriver and a hammer. I mean, it's still going to work. I mean, that's the problem, is that you can continue this. I mean, look, in some sense, despite all the great macroeconomic, indicators for Russia over the past few years, I mean, if you look at the balance sheet and all this stuff, it looks like textbook economics. I mean, but they're facing a demographic disaster. negative growth rates. The standard of living has been falling. Actually, they've been mired in actually a declining standard of living for a while. And now you have a ready-made excuse why this is the case. So when it gets worse, and it will, the Russians will like, yeah, that's to be expected. I mean, I'm just, my only hope for the sanctions is because they're so drastic and in some sense unprecedented, is that it's going to push, they're going to hurt more. So this will push harder toward trying to find outs with China and India and things like this. And this increasing dependence on China might give pause to Putin. Like, do I really want to do this? Or should I find some way to get myself out of this and relax this? But as we pointed also out, we have no credible way of signaling that the sanctions will end if the conflict ends one way or the other. So we had, yeah.
But I think the most important point is when the Russians release their knockoff iPhone, don't buy it. It won't be any good, and you will not be private.
And it will be very heavy.
And it will be very heavy.
May I take the word for a few remarks? I agree with you that the sanctions might only work in a very limited way, because over the last 2 weeks, I had a few conversations with some Russian Facebook friends. They are not my friends anymore, I have to say. And they all believe in their big leader. They are patriots. They don't doubt what he is saying. He knows what is best for the country. So, and of course, we don't kill Ukrainians. We go there and bring them food. All the propaganda, and they believe it 100%. Our hope, of course, would be sometimes people must doubt it if they can't buy their beloved Western goods anymore. Why can't the sportsmen participate in any championships any longer? Why can our artists no longer tour the world? But this doesn't work. It's in their propaganda. It's the West is against us. They want to destroy us, and people believe it. That's the fact. And those people who are critical to the regime, many of them have already left the country. That's for sure true. Well, there are numerous questions I would have, but this was just one quick remark from my side. Why I think that from the people in themselves, it will be very, very well. The only thing that might be a hope, and you, Branislav, has already mentioned it, on the 1st of April, there will be new conscripts. Some of the old conscripts that are at the moment at war in Ukraine, they will return to Russia. They might tell the people at home more what has happened there, which people then get to know a bit about the truth. And also somehow, somewhere, Putin and his leadership will have to declare, to explain to the mothers and wives the many coffins that returned to Russia. And we all know that this was part also why the Soviet regime fell when all these coffins came back from Afghanistan. So this is one of the hopes, but this is not a short-term thing, that is a medium-term thing.
You know, I went to see a German friend yesterday, and he was telling me that we were discussing this question, and he said, you know, in April 1945, when the Russian army was bearing down on Berlin and the entire country was destroyed and Berlin was just entirely rubble, if Hitler had emerged from his bunker and gotten into a food line in Berlin, they would have served him first. Because they never, not until the day of the surrender did they lose faith in the leader or in the idea. And I think it shows you some of the power of this stuff. And I think it points to avoiding a really persistent Western fantasy, which is that what we're dealing with here is a leader who is just suppressing a will to lead, just suppressing the people, and we're just fighting him. And if someone could just put a bullet in his head, everything would be better. That's not the case here. It's rarely the case. It's probably never the case. That Putin, for all of his talent and horror, is a very typical Russian leader. And, you know, under the current circumstances, the next Russian leader would not be dramatically different. So I don't think that this idea that we can use sanctions or anything else to create a sort of liberal revolution in Russia is the way to think about this problem.
I mean, to just kind of put a final nail in that coffin, I guess, we've had this, what I think is an erroneous approach, even back to the communist regime. When I read it, I mean, I grew up behind the Iron Curtain, and reading how academics here and pundits thought about it at the time, it's like as if everybody's a budding Democrat and just yearns to be free. That was not the case at all. That's the problem with these kind of places, that you go in there thinking, well, people want the same things we do, but they don't. And it's not just purely out of propaganda, actually. A lot of them simply disagree on a very fundamental level. You can see this in Bulgaria. 20% firmly in favor of Putin. They have full access to all the media that you have. There's absolutely no restrictions there. It is, in fact, very troubling just how strong support for Russia is there. And it's
20% seems a little low to me in Bulgaria.
Huh?
20% seems low to me in Bulgaria. You could get 20%.
Well, that's the ones that admit to it.
Okay.
It's because it's not like the most popular thing to say. So the ones who would openly admit to it, which is a big number, actually. That's a NATO member and an EU member, right? So I would caution again. I like everybody else, I love watching these videos that come out of Russia with people, dare to express disapproval of the regime and things like this. But that is just not anywhere. And the grieving mothers, yes, they were there at the end of communism, but frankly, that's not what brought down the Soviet Union at the end of the day. So what might happen? I mean, if the Russian army performs so badly as it has been so far and continues to do so, that's an if. I mean, there might be trouble for Russia internally in the sense that the Russian Federation, and this is something that Putin has no solution to, frankly. The communists had no solution to the multi-ethnicity problem in Russia. That takes us into a different story there. There might be other problems developing in Russia as a result of this war, is my point. But a popular revolt against him, not one of them, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's the thing to be looking for more than a popular revolt, is a sort of, the first thing that happens in Russia if central power seems weakened is that various regions strike out. Well, first, the sort of dependent SSRs, the Moldovas and the Georgias, and even Belarus, because they all are basically dependent on Russia but don't like it. They sort of break off very quickly, and even Belarus, which is probably pretty frightening to the Russians. But then I think some of the more restive regions within Russia, and there are plenty.
Yeah, I was joking a couple of days ago. Somebody asked me, "Can I find a map of Russia in Ukrainian just to, I don't know, demonstrate support?" And I said, "You should wait a little because we don't know if Russia will preserve its territorial integrity after this war. You may have to redraw the map." I know it's kind of seems crazy to think about it right now, but it is a real problem. I mean, one of the reasons of the Eastern European revolutions in '89 was the withdrawal of the threat of Russian intervention when Gorbachev said it, kind of opened up the floodgates. Satellites and the constituents, they have a problem that they never managed to solve, even with the unifying communist ideology at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important, but it's, I wouldn't want to, and I don't think you're doing this, but I wouldn't want to convey the idea that this is an optimistic scenario.
No, that's terrible. No.
It's because this is unleashing a lot of separatist chaos in some very restive parts of the world.
I did not mean it this way, no.
Yeah, no, I don't think that you did, but it's. I just wanted to emphasize that it's the fall of the Soviet Union. The fact that was peaceful to the degree it was, and there were some places like Romania where it was not, but it was largely peaceful. That was quite surprising, unusual, and historically, and probably not an experiment we should want to repeat, because it's not likely to go as well as it did that time. And I think a loss of integrity in Russia, a loss of Russian control of the satellite countries would be a very violent experience, and that's quite frightening to me. I think you're muted again, Jamie.
Sorry, I'd like to open it up to everyone in this room, if anyone has any questions or would like to comment on what's being discussed. Seeing none.
I think Indrek, I'm waiting for Indrek.
I have a question, Jamie, actually.
Yes,
Thanks to both of you guys for joining and sharing your insights and your experiences here, which are really valuable to all of us. Obviously, you know, we all watch a lot of the same media. Some of us maybe get a little bit broader and look at local media and maybe foreign press a bit more, but I think the overwhelming consensus is definitely that the war has not gone according to Putin's initial plans. And today, you know, at face value anyway, Ukraine seems to be doing a little bit better than had been anticipated, and now their fears of possibly Putin feeling maybe backed into a corner, the more that Ukraine might succeed. And with that, the possibility of I guess unknown paths, fewer off ramps, and potentially an escalation. In the meantime, the West is really providing a lot of support to Ukraine militarily with artillery, and we see sanctions, economic sanctions that, at least from the Kremlin side, amount to economic warfare. And I guess that kind of raises a couple of questions for me anyway. One is, you know, the Kremlin has kind of drawn a line, supposedly, that if the West is seen providing any material support to Ukraine, that they would see, you know, some response that history's never seen before, and people worry about things like nuclear warfare, chemical, biological, and all of this. But in reality, I guess those concerns seem to be, from what you guys are describing, maybe not concerns that we need to worry too much about today. I wonder, you know, under what scenarios do you think Russia might actually, how backed into a corner would Russia have to be in order to resort to, you know, very, very extreme measures? And to what extent do you see this as a humiliating sort of experience for Putin? And I wonder about the historical sort of, there's been a lot of really interesting journalism and research into what's actually driving this. This is maybe a very deep-rooted concern that dates back to the disintegration, really, of the Soviet Union and Putin's desire to rebuild the Soviet Union. And I guess I wonder, how real is that threat going forward, that Russia might actually be looking for something way beyond Ukraine, maybe to build you know, its sphere of influence back to something not on par with the Soviet Union, as it were, but certainly a lot wider sort of sphere of influence. I don't know that it's limited necessarily to Ukraine, and I wondered your perspectives on exactly, you know, in an ideal world, you know, how far does Putin really want to go? Is he running out of time? Is this because he's old and he's running out of time, or what's your thinking on some of those things? I realize there's a lot there, but to the extent you can address maybe any of that, I'd really be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think Jeremy is going to accuse me of reading Putin's mind, but
Probably.
I'm not going to do any such thing.
You've read my mind.
I mentioned that, well, I want to talk a little bit about the timing of this, why this is happening now. And I think part of the reason is because his strategy of indirect control was failing, actually, in the states around him. So thus far, my idea was, I thought what he was trying to do is control Kiev, Ukraine, the way he was, you know, controlling Belarus with, you know, in the firm embrace of Russia, the way he's developing these relations with the other post-successor states. And that strategy, when Euromaidan happened, you know, was a big slap in his face, obviously. And then that's why he created this condition in Eastern Ukraine, which was escalation, frozen conflict, basically to destabilize this new government in Ukraine in an attempt to basically bring it back. I think the blitzkrieg idea was not to occupy Ukraine or anything like this. It was just to topple that government and put another one in its place that's going to do his bidding. In that sense, that's what I mean, unlimited goals. He has the exact same goals essentially for all these countries around him. I mean, it's pretty clear. And the problem for him is that they were wobbly. I mean, Belarus faced serious protests. He offered to send troops there to help Lukashenko stay in power, but Lukashenko handled it. Just this year, at the beginning, in Kazakhstan, there were protests against the government, which is pro-Russian, the government. So he actually did send troops as part of their internal security force, 2,500 troops to help them put it down. So if you're sitting in Moscow and looking at this, like, developments don't look good in terms of your ability to control your periphery. And I think that's part of the reason that provoked this intervention. And again, I think I certainly could not predict the way we reacted and how strong the response has been. I actually thought it'd be more along the lines of Crimea, which is why I thought, there's a good reason for him. I mean, now in retrospect, it seems like a mistake, but on the 24th, I don't think it was, actually.
Yeah, well, look, I think that the sort of strategy of indirect control, I think the Russians have been, more than just Vladimir Putin, but the Russian leadership in general has been very clear over the last 20 so years that they want a sort of form of indirect control throughout the former Soviet Union, probably excluding. They have been quite clear about excluding the Baltic states, interestingly, but except for that, they've been very consistent for a long time. So you don't have to read Vladimir Putin's mind for that. I think the strategy of indirect control basically means that you don't want to invade or occupy or integrate the countries, but that you do want to essentially control their politics to a degree that they can't ever come out against you and they can't align with the West. And part of the reason for that is, I guess there's a sort of imperial impulse there that all countries have, all big great powers have. But there's also a sense that if you don't do that, you're very vulnerable to the West, because the West has these institutions, NATO, the EU, which can sort of creep up to your border and can essentially do sort of regime change from the inside. And so that's why Ukraine became sort of the sort of prime battleground. But before that, there were battlegrounds in Georgia, in Moldova, in almost all of the former Soviet, well, all of the European FSU countries, even in Belarus to a degree, although it wasn't actually forced. But there was constant contestation between the West and Russia, even in Belarus. So I think that's, that is a sort of semi-imperial, semi-defensive goal. I'm not really sure it matters how, so I find that reasonably defined. I'm not really sure it matters whether I'm wrong or not, actually, because Russia, if Russia wants to conquer the world, okay, they're not going to. We've just seen the Russian army fail to capture Kiev, which is 40 kilometers from the Belarus border, 40 miles. So Russia is scary but weak, and whatever plans the Kremlin has for integrating Poland are irrelevant. I don't think they have one, but if they did, it wouldn't matter. To me, the issue here is that, and I think it's worth expanding out. We have a bigger problem. We have a China which actually definitely is interested in controlling the world and has a shot at it. And so we should probably be thinking more about the quiet, aggressive, strong power than the noisy, aggressive, weak power. I think that that's why these events so serve China's interests. And so I guess I think that I guess it's, to me, this sort of constant focus on whether Vladimir Putin wants to conquer the world, I think misses the key developments.
Just to clarify, I mean, I don't think that anybody thinks he wants to conquer the world. They want to change the world order, that's for sure, together with China.
I can assure, that's a slight exaggeration, but I can assure you that many people in Washington believe he wants to conquer all of Europe.
God help us all. No.
In fact, if you look at Anne Applebaum wrote a piece just a few weeks ago in the Atlantic, where she basically said, Vladimir Putin's goal is to destroy democracy throughout the world.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, I will beg to disagree with that. But yes, no. I mean, not with your characterization. I don't see any evidence of that. But the point I wanted to make is that two. One is just putting my head as a Bulgarian American on. We have to also remember, I mean, that people that live in these countries that Russians indirectly control are not very happy about this. It is not good for them. It's not good for the economy, for their well-being or anything like this. It's always been a problem. So I know that these kind of considerations don't really play into your foreign policy a whole lot. But as somebody who grew up,
I think it's totally fair and it's totally relevant. It's just the question is, how can we best help them, really?
Exactly.
And to me, the idea that we sort of take them into NATO and force or talk about taking them into NATO and then thus sort of inspiring the Russians to invade them and destroy Mariupol and Kharkiv and Kiev, this has not helped the Ukrainian people.
No, although again, it's difficult for me to believe that Russians thought that Ukraine would be going into NATO or the European Union anytime soon.
You know, I had many Russian government officials tell me that they thought that would happen. And it wasn't too surprising in the end of the day, because in 2008, every NATO leader signed a statement saying that Ukraine would go into NATO.
Yeah.
And in every NATO summit since then, they have reaffirmed that pledge.
The European Union has also talked for a quarter of a century about how Turkey is.
I know you and I probably don't believe it, but the Russians actually even believe in U.S. ballistic missile defense. But so it's not that crazy to think that they might believe it, since we say it all the time.
Just the same argument you just made about ignore Putin's threats to the world because he can't execute them. I would say the same things. Like my question always has been in these situations, like, okay, suppose NATO expanded into Ukraine. Suppose that happened. And then what?
I'm not sure I follow your point.
Well, what exactly is NATO going to be doing to Russia? I mean, I think the threat to Putin has been exactly this.
They have a very well articulated idea of how this would hurt them. Right?
Well, I think not any more than the internal threat that these.
I guess I don't find this that difficult to conceive of. If the Russians were inviting Mexico and Canada to join the CSTO and setting up governments that were dependent on them and establishing military bases in Russia and Mexico, that would make me nervous.
You know what the difference, however, here is? And the difference is that the Russian problem has always been that they are not an attractive partner to anybody. So that's been the security problem for the long time, that they cannot keep these countries oriented toward them.
That's a different point. The point is that it's normal for countries to feel scared when their enemies establish alliances with countries on their borders and establish military bases in them. That's a normal thing to do.
Now that we are now a declared enemy again, it was not, I think, arguably not quite the same just 2 months ago.
I think they have felt that since at least 2003, maybe something around there.
Yeah, we could argue to what extent that's true. But again, since we can't read their minds, I'm just going to be basing the stuff on statements by their own military, essentially. That they assess that, of course, the West is a threat, a strategic threat. And
they have assessed that the West is a strategic threat in every military doctrine that they have elaborated in the last 20 years. Not what?
Not an existential or an immediate threat that needs to be dealt with. But anyway, this is an internal debate that I think is irrelevant. As you said, it doesn't matter whether we're right or wrong on this one, actually.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Because their strategy to control the states around them is very clear. Like, whether this is part of a global domination plan or not, it won't matter, because it needs to, it will stop either because he doesn't have the capability to expand it, or because he doesn't have the willingness. But he doesn't have the capability. It doesn't matter what he wants, actually. So we agree on this. But I think the threat to his regime was internal, in the sense that countries around this periphery turning pro-Western, which they do because the West can simply bribe them in a sense. I mean, you give them the trade relationships, you do all this crap, and not crap, good things for the countries in a sense, and they naturally go that way. And they provide an example for the others. It's an infectious thing. And then suddenly the others have ideas of destabilizing the pro-Russian governments. And then before you know it, there's problems in Russia, people getting wrong ideas. I think that is the big threat always been to Russia. It's not so much the military dimension as the loss of control because of these tendencies, which are due in part to Russia simply not being a partner. Like, what are you going to get there? A Russian iPhone? I mean, exactly. It's like, aside from the stuff that they sell already, what else are they going to offer you? So even the faithful satellites, immediately they turn pro-Western when it comes to economic and financial matters. That's the issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. The West has a much better offer, and at the end of the day, the Russian problem is that their offer isn't very good, and ultimately that could occur to people in Russia as well. And that's a real threat. The problem we have is that but frankly, if you're running the Russian regime, that's an existential threat to your regime. And countries get to determine their own threat perception. So they are reacting against precisely that threat. And our view might be, well, geez, this would be a good thing. That's not their view. And they have the power to do something about it. They don't have the power to conquer the world, but they have the power to make life incredibly miserable in Ukraine and in the other surrounding countries. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? We can't make Russia go away. We can't change the regime in Russia. We don't have the resources really to stop them from meddling and destabilizing their neighbors. So we probably should try to reach an agreement with them that allows them to coexist in this situation. And that is something that, frankly, we have never tried to do. I guess I agree by and large with the sort of diagnosis of the problem. The solutions befuddle me, because it seems to me that every time you sort of say, well, this is the situation and it's the Russians' fault, I'm like, yeah, it is the Russians' fault, who cares? The problem is that that we have to figure out what to do about it. And I'm not really entranced by the solutions that say we have to change the Russian regime or, conquer Moscow.
That leads into the last question, but let me just say, I'm not just saying that's the Russians' fault in a sense. I'm saying it's not actually, we may not be able to do much about it in a very important way, because part of the reason they're losing influence is not that, we're bribing them, it's that these governments have an economic, essential interest in turning, pro-Western in that sense. So unless you deny them this autonomy and basically say, you know what, you're in the Russian sphere of influence, we're not going to deal with you, which I think is a difficult thing for us to do. And part of it is the moral dimension, that you're basically abandoning, in a sense, these people to the mercies of the Russian in Moscow, which as a Bulgarian, I take a very kind of visceral exception to, I have to say. It just bugs me. And of course, maybe that's the fate if you're a small country bordering Russia. Maybe that's your lot in life. Tough luck that your geography sucks kind of thing. But I think we cannot just allow this to happen, frankly. So yes, whatever modus vivendi we find with Russia will not be able to alleviate their fundamental security threat if they keep perceiving it in that way, which is why we're in for a very long haul with this. Because again, we can't change their perception. And on the other hand, we can't really give them what would secure them in this way.
Well, it's interesting. I guess I mostly agree with it, but I think it's interesting to hear what you're saying. And because this is kind of what the Russians say too, which is, in some ways, the reason we can't create a modus vivendi with them is that we can't stop. We can't stop as a sort of culture, as a Western culture, that the Russians always say the Americans can't stop, and that we can't reach a modus vivendi with them because we can't stop meddling in Ukraine and Belarus, that we can't stop offering them the thing that you want to offer them. And, and I guess, yeah, sometimes I think, gee, maybe we could. We did during the Cold War, we stopped mostly. We reached this modus vivendi. And I guess I felt like history vindicated it. Instead of fighting for Hungary and Czechoslovakia and destroying them in the process, we waited for 45 years for a good opportunity for that Western bargain, which is so much better, to be able to sort of prevail. And it seems to me that this is always what I call the sort of East Berlin strategy, because basically all we did with East Berlin was sort of put it next to West Berlin and make it look at it for 45 years. And that was enough to eventually create some sort of movement when there was weakness in the Soviet Union, as was described. So but we haven't, I mean, it's very clear that since the 90s, we haven't had that strategy. We've had a strategy, as you just described, of really pushing very, very hard and of insisting that, Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova shouldn't have to live with this bullshit for another day. And to me, while I would prefer that they didn't live with the bullshit for another day, the result of that has predictably been that these countries end up as battlefields. And I do think that that's worse than being a Russian dependent.
Yeah. So my original prediction for this was we will pull basically a Hungary 56 or Czechoslovakia 68 on this.
Yeah.
Which, it pained me. And that's why I actually argued at the time in 2014 after Crimea. I said, we need to tell the Ukrainians they're on their own in this and they have to find a way to live with Russia, because push comes to shove, we're just not going to do it. The situation now in Ukraine, because of the way this change is like, I'm not sure we have this option right now because of what the Ukrainians are doing and how they're doing it, right? Our only option to influence them is to start cutting off some of the aid that we're giving them, which I think is going to be extremely difficult politically to do, right? So, while, yeah, it's the same question that this historian A.J.P. Taylor asked about the beginning of World War II. It's like, the Western Allies betrayed Czechoslovakia in 1938 and came to aid Poland in 1939. Would you rather be a live Czech or a dead Pole when this happened? Again, he was exaggerating. A.J.P. Taylor, he's of course being who he is. But yes, of course, you're talking about, citizens being murdered and mass cities being flattened. Whether this is better or not than a free life, I cannot tell, because that's not my choice to make. The Ukrainians seem to be making this choice, and they're the only ones who can make it. We can only decide to what extent we're going to support this, right? And it's... Yeah,
well, but, I mean, I think we have an interest...
If he had stopped this if he had invaded just the eastern part, we probably would have pulled exactly a Hungary or a Czechoslovakia on them. That's my expectation. Is that he did it in this way and the fact that the Ukrainian government didn't run, and now this is guerrilla warfare is going to be probably even in the east. So the answer to directly the question, I don't see that we can abandon the Ukrainians the way we abandoned the eastern satellites when they tried to do anything, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the way the Ukrainians have what they've done so far. But that makes the prospect looming about the future of Ukraine is very difficult now to see. Yeah. Because they do need to, I mean, they're going to border Russia forever. It's like then it's not going to go away.
I think that's all very wise. And I think it really, I think the most important point for the group is that he's pointing out, which is so essential, is that we've entered into a political dynamic already in which the West has lost a lot of agency, a lot of control, because of the way that the Ukrainians have been so successful at both militarily and at manipulating the information environment. And this means that we've entered into a dynamic in which there's a sort of escalation that could involve us directly, which we kind of don't have control of, and which strangely the Ukrainians have more control over than we do. That's a result. That was not true on February 23rd. And so to me, again, that's another reason why we had, because this type of dynamic doesn't always happen. I think you're right about Hungary 56, but it often happens. where we end up getting sort of trapped by these allies, by the wartime dynamics. Kosovo is a much smaller example, but it's a great example because in fact, at one point we told the Kosovo Liberation Army that they should settle, and they said, no, we're going to go to war and you're going to support us. And they were right. And it was a similar dynamic to this. So I do think that we have lost a lot of agency, and that should frighten us. And I think that the lesson I want to bring out is that that's why you don't want these wars to start.
And it happens even on the other side. I mean, Milosevic was trapped by the Bosnian Serbs in the same way.
Yeah.
He lost complete control of them and ended up with Serbia being bombed and, in the end, and him going eventually to the Hague.
I do want to invite Indrek's input. He's a member of the European Parliament from Estonia and a classmate of ours. If you're willing, Indrek.
Do you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I mean, it has been really interesting to listen, and I was not prepared to intervene, but just 3 remarks. First of all, as we all know from history, the greatest mistake of the United States in all the world wars is that it comes in too late and after a direct attack to its interests. So now we have the opportunity to join in time. And exactly the time is finally to defeat the enemy. That is what we should do, from my perspective. Article 5 has been used only once against Taliban, and not Taliban, but Al-Qaeda, I think. So Al-Qaeda actually killed less people than Russia has killed, even in this special military operation. Let me remind you, Russia is a state that managed to kill 100 million people during the 20th century. So they attacked again. Let them pay the cost. Okay, I understand it's a difficult talk, but I mean, looking at the map, right now, we could put a platoon, 32 guys with light arms and go to Leningrad or St. Petersburg. Like this, what is that movie with George Clooney? Some kind of glorious bastards. They say, hunt for Nazi stolen art. I mean, I could bring the Hermitage paintings to the Netherlands market within like 10 days because they don't have any troops there in Leningrad Oblast. And we have seen that their military machine,
paintings from them.
Their military machine doesn't work. It works like the Soviet army where I had a privilege to serve 40 years ago. And so basically, what we need to do is just to show that we are serious. I'm not speaking about marching in millions of men and manpower and tactics. We need to show 1, 2, 3 times that when NATO speaks about smart precision weapons, they are really smart precision, not like the Russian things which hit the hospitals and theaters. And Putin will run deep into Ural Mountains and never come on the surface again because he is a coward. He is a simple, mediocre KGB guy who was trained to torture our people, the civilian people. He doesn't know anything better than cracking the finger bones of anti-Soviet elements. So, and finally, the crucial element of a plan. How should we do it? We should bomb some Russian troops in Belarus and say, first, we didn't do it. It's the Belarusians who did it. Second, we say, but they were preparing some chemical birds to fly on us, and that we were forced to do it because they were threatening us our way of living, our special mission. And thirdly, we could say that, anyway, we are not in war with Russia. It's special military operation against Lukashenko. Stay away, Russians. Now, finally, of course, I know it's not good to make jokes in a serious situation, and we need to consider the nuclear threat. Well, I don't think Putin is in position to launch even a nuclear threat. Where is Shoigu? Where is Gerasimov? All the generals have disappeared. So probably they are not interested in ending up in some kind of nuclear eternal winter where they don't exist. So this command will not be executed. And even if it were executed, I mean, again, look at the Russian weaponry. You remember the submarine Kursk? It's in the bottom of the ocean. Why? Because it was supposed to fire the torpedo out, but it fired it in. So the same goes with all 1,600 nuclear warheads of Russia. They are not rising up, they go deep inside the earth. And well, I don't know how many volcanic islands will emerge around Japan after that. But basically, the Russian military is bullshit. It's time to stop it. That's what I say. Otherwise, again, the discussion is really good. And I should stop here, not to spoil.
So when Jeremy was talking about the loss of U.S. agency, that is what he had in mind.
Yeah.
Let the Estonians decide and see what happens.
Yeah.
Let me just put a little bit, like, I know it's a far-fetched scenario, but Belarus does have a defense treaty with Russia. If you just bomb anything in Belarus, there's a good chance that it will activate. Now, if they send troops across the border in Ukraine, then it's a bit more of an open question. We actually might be able to neutralize this if they go against the supply routes and things like this. You know, the Russian military may be a joke compared to NATO, but it's no joke regionally. And their potential for destruction is tremendous. And what I'm worried about is not whether NATO could win a war against Russia in some sense. Because, yeah, I mean, short of not invading and occupying, forget that part. But, yeah, destroying their capability, maybe. But we're talking civilian casualties of unimaginable magnitude. I think we should be, that's what we're worried about. It's nobody has any doubt in the NATO capabilities. I mean, Zelensky himself said, give me 1% of what you guys got and I'll take care of it. That's probably right. Which is why he's not getting it. I mean, as I said, as a Bulgarian, I know exactly where you're coming from. That is like my dream scenario is, you know, if I were writing fiction. But there are no, again, the Ukrainians are doing a bang-up job, true. 90% of the Russian military capability is intact. They're not running out of missiles. They're not, I mean, and they don't have to be smart to destroy a lot of people.
Yeah, we know, I think we know by and large what the Russian military is capable of, what it's good at and what it's bad at. And I would assert that in this crisis, the Russian military hasn't been the surprise. It's been the Ukrainian military that's been the surprise. The Russian military has no good NCO corps, so it's very bad at maneuver, and it's very bad at logistics. The things, so it's playing to type. And I think if we realize that, if we think that it's playing to type, we should remember what the Russian military is good at. The Russian military is good at sort of generating combat power, brute combat power, but just combat. So they will replenish losses. They will, over time, they will get their new cadre of recruits, and they'll force the last cadre to stay, and they will regenerate combat power. The other thing that they're good at is long grinding wars. And the final thing that they're good at, I would say, is bombardment, both aerial and artillery. And so that's, that was their, at the end of the day, that's not where they started in either Chechnya or Syria, but that's where they ended up in both Chechnya and Syria. And so maybe it's where they'll end up here. And it's a very sobering, I think, idea for for Ukraine. It means there can be pauses and things, but in Syria, basically they sort of moved from city to city, and basically with the Syrian allies, of course, and destroyed every city along the way. And so I think that's quite sobering. I think we should be aware of what Russian military power is. I agree with Branislav that it's not NATO, it's not equivalent to NATO, but it's still quite serious. I think we should also take quite seriously the Russian nuclear forces. It is the American intelligence assessment is very different than you gave. It's that these forces are operable, and I'm sure that some percentage of them won't work, but they don't need even 10% of those forces to work to destroy the world. The idea that we are going to launch a military operation into Belarus because we think that the Russian missiles are going to go the wrong way, I think is probably a poor bet.
I have a question. Why is it that so many Russian generals are being taken out? I think they're on number 7 today. I mean, generals usually aren't close to the front lines, at least I don't know, maybe they are, but why in this case do you think in the Russian strategy they are?
I have a
and
theory
second
about
question
this.
is, why haven't they been able to get air superiority yet?
I mean, are they taken in disproportionately? I think the rule of thumb is you lose 2,000 soldiers for every general. So if they took out 6 or 7, and the upper limit of what we assess their casualty, dead soldiers be, they're kind of right in range of where it's supposed to be. I think they're taking them out for the reasons that people discuss. I mean, we provide intelligence about their movement. They're sometimes forced to use unencrypted lines which can be intercepted. The Ukrainians have organized in a very kind of Western style warfare. They're very mobile. They have this knife. They can track them. They can take them out. I mean, it's not a. But again, I think proportionally, it seems like a lot, but that's only if if they weren't taking any other casualties, and they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me I haven't thought about whether it's proportional or not, but it is very clear that the Russian communication system, the encrypted communication system that they had deployed at great cost, hasn't been working. I think it has something to do with lack of access to the cell towers, which they destroyed. That they unfortunately destroyed on the way into Ukraine, which might have been a tactical error. Yeah. But regardless, I think it's also indicative, and Branislav said this, that of Western intelligence sharing. And I think one of the things that's been revealed by this crisis is just how good the Western intelligence is about the Russian military. And so it's very clear to me that I can see a lot of evidence on the ground, including the death of generals, that Western intelligence is feeding real time into Ukrainian military dispositions. And I can't assess how much that has to do with their success, but I think it probably, it can't be at the bottom of their success, because the fundamental thing at the bottom of their success is that their coherence has held and their morale has held. But I think it's probably quite important. And to me, the killing of the generals is the thing that's most indicative of that.
I mean, the one that clearly the generals are going to places where normally you would not expect them to see, right? Close to the line of fire. I think that's a problem of communications, that they can't organize the troops properly. I mean, the corrosion in the Russian army, we had probably a pretty good idea about its capabilities, but the extent of corrosion in this, because of corruption internally in that state, is just mind-boggling sometimes. That they don't have basic things that here people would have taken for granted, at least the military.
Yes, but I think that's part of the sort of common understanding of the Russian.
No, we knew, but yeah. I was surprised that it was deeper than we thought it was deep, but I think it went even deeper than we expected, frankly. It's like that story with the tractor, right? When after Crimea, they decided they need to build a tractor in Russia. And there was a factory that was making it. They poured millions and millions of rubles into it, and finally they produced the shiny, great Russian tractor. And the regional government took pictures with this and everything, and then it turned out the guy had embezzled the money, and he was importing parts from the Czech Republic and just assembling them there. I mean, it's not surprising in some sense, but I still am just stunned that listening to some of the intercepted communications between soldiers, what they're reporting, what they're lacking, and how poorly they're organized, is just mind-boggling to me.
I was particularly struck by the FSB officers that embezzled the money that was intended
It's supposed to go to bribes, yes.
Yeah.
There's one reason
you can't count on anybody these days.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's another thing we didn't quite discuss, right? It's among the reasons for the invasion, why Putin was basically so optimistic how it's going to turn out, is because he was told it's going to work. The people who stole the money that was supposed to bribe a bunch of Ukrainians into supporting him would not tell him they stole the money. They told him everything's distributed, everything's, you know, ready to go, because I think most of them probably didn't think he would actually do it. That's why now they're sitting in house arrest and God knows where.
We have a couple of questions in the comments from David Van Oppen, unless, David, you want to ask the question yourself. Otherwise, I'll just read it. This experience is like training wheels to the Chinese, who are very much taking notes and analyzing. To what extent is the initial lukewarm response that has now intensified, especially related to sanctions that are arguably more effective than many prior sanctions, a warning or prep to China as opposed to purely defending Ukraine?
I guess I feel as if the Chinese probably aren't taking many lessons from this, at least for their own situation, I would say. I could be wrong about that, because as was said earlier, the Chinese are very opaque. What I base that on is just that the Chinese are, like, well, I guess all nations are, but the Chinese even more so, are incredibly solipsistic and arrogant. And they basically think of their situation as entirely unique. And they don't think that what happens to the Russians can conceivably happen to them or has anything to do with Taiwan. I think that and by the way, they don't think that even the Western reaction is the same, will be the same, because of their situation being unique, and the West is a lot more focused on them. And actually, that's a sort of typical effect in international relations, is that you have a lot of trouble reading across like that. And maybe that's the right way to think about it. I think that they are trying to take the military technical lessons. I think we saw them do that a lot after the various American wars. And what they tend to do is these are semi-public. They have a lot of lessons learned exercises within the PLA about how the military proceeded and what it tells you about the balance of forces and the different technologies and things like that. So they will be looking very much at the performance of the weapons and the strategies, and they will probably be trying to inform their military doctrine from that. I think one of the things that the Chinese are very, very nervous about, they've been doing this massive military buildup in the last several years. It's been going fairly well in terms of its sort of technological upgrading. I think they've made quite a bit of progress. They have a long way to go, and they know that. They are really worried about the question of, I guess, expertise, experience. And they were relying to a degree on the sense that the Russian army was combat tested, because they're not. And it makes them very nervous that the Americans fight all the time and seem to be, at least in a technical level, so good at it. Politically not so great, but technically pretty good. And so I think they will be discouraged by the lack of expertise and lack of professional proficiency shown by the Russians, and that will encourage them all the more to be careful about how they use their forces and to be thinking about ways in which they can up their expertise and professionalism, without getting into stupid wars.
So just to amplify, if you want a more nightmarish scenario here, I mean, one of the things that the Chinese must be taking notes on for sure is that if NATO was able to arm the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians could provide this level of resistance to the battle-tested Russian army, that's a worrying sign, a very worrying sign about the degree of military, like the discrepancy in the military capabilities, right? And they're surely taking notes on this. But who else might be taking notes, and this is what I'm worried about, is Taiwan. I mean, what if Taiwan decides now is the time to go independent for sure? Because given this response to Ukraine, maybe now is our chance. I mean, maybe that's far-fetched, but that actually worries me a lot if something like this happens. You know, in China, there's the two wings. You know, Xi, who's basically clearly said that he does have a goal in eventually returning the wayward province back to China, and an opposition wing which wants to continue the Deng Xiaoping's older kind of, let's just get prosperous, keep our heads down. That's fine. We don't need to, you know, do anything like this. The policy that has been working great for the Chinese, frankly. I mean, they're everywhere now around the world. Last time I was in Beijing, just to give you an indication of this, on this 50th Conference for Prosperity, World Peace, Happiness. I don't know, it had 50 words in the title. And where the mayor of Beijing was there, and they were talking all about the Belt and Roads Initiative. So they plastered this world map to show how China is connected everywhere. And I was looking, it's like, this map, something looks wrong. Like, China was in the center of it. Of course, in Europe is in the center, and the US is in the center. That's fine. And I looked, and it's like, you know what's missing in this map? The US was not even on the map. I mean, it was amazing. That just wasn't there. It's completely, we've taken over the world kind of thing. So that strategy has been working for them, but there is an internal struggle in the party. I'm actually a little worried that if some kind of tensions escalate over Taiwan right now, it might in fact strengthen Xi's hold on the regime and silence all the opposition because of the usual kind of rallying around the flag effect there. So, yeah. The Chinese, I mean, what they're probably also learning from this is that they knew that, you know, these economies are vulnerable to Western sanctions if the West can get its act together, which is not a given, of course. And they're now going to take some measures to, you know, be able to find loopholes in the newer ones that we imposed that hadn't been done before. But that's basically it.
Yeah, but they were already doing that. They were already.
No, I said, yeah, the moment you invent new ways to sanction, they're going to find the new loophole. So they're learning from this as well.
Yeah, and they've been engaged for at least the last 10 years in a sort of long, slow effort at sanction proofing, which is making some progress.
Yeah, no, I was asking the question a little bit from the other side. I mean, I think, you know, China's objectives are quite clear. China, you know, the idea that China would help mediate a solution, I think, is not there. It's not in China's interest to mediate a solution, and it doesn't mediate generally. It was more that the response to Ukraine seemed to be kind of, you know, from the West side, and granted, many didn't predict, or, you know, the amount of involvement that did occur, i.e. a full-fledged invasion, but the response was fairly lukewarm, right? You're kind of on your own, and that's been increasing to, in some ways, direct support. And the sanctions, I mean, I would call this sanctions plus, right? So sanctions generally, the Chinese understand sanctions, a lot of countries in the world understand sanctions and live under them quite well. But, you know, this is, you know, repossessing oligarchs' yachts probably doesn't exist within a legal framework. It's being done with the legal framework to follow, right? You took my yacht when you weren't supposed to, and fine, 4 years later, you get your yacht back. So it's more from that perspective, the response that then came from the West, to what extent do we think that's just Russia, Ukraine? And to what extent is the Western response really got its eye on the ball that the next problem, it isn't Russia, it's China, right? And this is the reason the response is maybe more than it was initially?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm agreeing with you or disagreeing, but from my perspective, the Western response was surprising from the perspective of last year, but not surprising from the perspective of February 23rd. And what I mean by that is that the US administration had made a decision back in October, probably, that they saw this invasion coming and that they were going to frame that war in a certain way. And they embarked on what can only be described as a Russian-style information campaign starting in November to frame what they saw as they had until I was talking to these people. I was quite shocked by it. They were 100% sure that this invasion was coming. 100. They had a degree of certainty that I wouldn't have had if I had an intercept of Putin saying I'm going to invade on February 24th. I had a very high-level U.S. officials saying to me constantly, they are going. They had a date on their calendar actually as of February 8th or 9th. And then at a certain point, a few weeks before the war, they told me it had been delayed to February 22nd or 23rd. They were off by like 12 hours. I have no idea how they knew this. I didn't believe it entirely at the time. But in any case, they framed, they used that knowledge to frame the information environment such that they forced the Russians to deny that they were going to do this multiple times. They forced them to deny it to the face of many, many Western leaders. They went over to Europe, to all of the main Western allies, particularly the Germans, presented them with this. That when the Germans said, well, we don't really believe you, they said, well, okay, we'll see if you're right. And then they humiliated them with the fact that they had been correct. And so they really set the stage for a very strong Western response. And then I think building on that was the point that several people have made, is that the Ukrainians, who weren't participating in this prior to February 24th at all, after February 24th, suddenly became the most effective information warriors in the world. I was quite shocked by this, the sort of emergence of Zilensky, who was really a horrible leader in February 23rd, suddenly seems to be Winston Churchill. And I can remember he had a phone call on Christmas Eve with 25 US senators. I don't know how you get 25 US senators on a call on Christmas Eve. But the US was so concerned about the Russian troops on the border that 25 US senators were willing to talk to Zelensky on Christmas Eve. And they said, what do you need for the Russian invasion? And he said, that's not happening. I don't need anything. What I need is you to help me arrest Poroshenko, his also anti-Russian political enemy within Ukraine. He was entirely focused on which corrupt oligarchic cabal was running Ukraine, which is typical for Ukrainian politicians, but somewhat dispiriting when there's 150,000 troops on the border. So I had no expectation that he would rise to this occasion, but clearly he has. I guess it underlines the point that Elliot Cohen used to make a lot at SAIS, that wartime leaders are very different than peacetime leaders, and it's very hard to tell who will be good at which. But in any case, I think that those two factors, the American information campaign and the Ukrainian, before the war, and the Ukrainian information campaign after the war began, have both been so effective that it has really galvanized a Western response.
I mean, I think that's an important point in the sense that that's why it makes the answer to the question about China basically impossible right now, because the response will depend exactly on how it happens, if it happens, and what happens.
Yeah.
Part of the reason Putin was optimistic is he could not have predicted this. I think the U.S. government, it was characterized, they did the Russian strategy. I would just say that was brilliant in terms of the foreign policy, how this was done, because essentially it forced a revelation essentially of intent by the Russians, that they could not do the false flag operations. They could not pretend oh, right now something happened, we have to go in. I mean, they still tried it when it started, but they simply could not do this given this persistent, they're coming. Everybody's like, oh, no, they're not, and they're lying. So in a way, if you want a historical analogy to this, there's why the British, sold Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938, but not Poland. It's not that they were much better prepared to go to war over Poland. That's why they started it by dropping leaflets, obviously. But forcing the other guy to reveal their hand by invading is a way to galvanize support to oppose him. And this is very painful. I mean, this was the response the US administration gave to the Israelis in 1967. It's like, if you go in first, it'd be very difficult for us to support you politically. If you get attacked, it's a different matter entirely. We certainly did not tell the Ukrainians, stay there and get attacked and we'll come. But that's how it played out. And I think this is what galvanized the support. Plus, there was a question here in the chat, whether public expressions in Western Europe important. I think absolutely. Absolutely. These people turning out in Germany, especially to upend, 50 years of Ostpolitik. I would not have predicted this. So saying this is exactly how the West would have responded basically requires you to have predicted all of this. And one possibility here is that Putin could have predicted and decided not to quite invade in this way. So I'm actually that is part of the reason, I'm not reading his mind, but that is part of the reason I'm thinking we probably know what his aims are, because even this would not stop him. These are things that he could have looked at, and people in his entourage were telling him at the time, because some of them were public that they were saying, and they just disregarded it. The Western response could have fallen apart, basically. And the fact that it didn't is because of the way the invasion happened in particular, and that's what makes it unpredictable.
We have more questions, but I do want to respect your time. If you guys want to indicate when you want to leave, I'm sticking around until the last one is standing. But we're at 2 hours.
You know how that's how that works. It's a tough group.
So I'm just minutes. Okay. One more question. There are actually 2 questions. C.W. Keeney, I'm not sure who that is, but and Wolfgang have related questions. C.W. Keeney.
Colin is from the UAE club here. He's from 2010 SAIS.
Okay, great. Does the Russian street view Ukraine and other former pieces of the old Russian Empire as fair game? Does the average Russian think this is a legitimate objective of warfare, or is it just really Putin and his dreams of restored empire and grandeur? And Wolfgang asks, if Russians will concentrate now on the east in Donbass, where will they stop? Cherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Transnistria, Chisinau, etc.
So judging what the average Russian thinks is a bit difficult, obviously, because the surveys are not entirely reliable, because a lot of people are aware of what kind of government they have, so they may not be quite forthcoming with particular answers to particular questions. So the Ukrainians have actually used this for very effective informational campaigns, where they do these supposed surveys when they find out 70% of Russians want to attack Poland or some crazy stuff like this. That's just insane. So from what I know, and I do know a lot of Russians and a lot of Ukrainians, these, at least so many of their friends and stuff, they don't perceive this as an attack on Ukraine. This is not a war that they're fighting in Ukraine. They're still there just to remove a couple of elements that are really suppressing the Ukrainian people, and that's all that's going on. I mean, for us, it's kind of difficult to believe, but again, remember, I told you, it's just, I think, unfathomable to your average Russian that Russians would be attacking Ukrainians. It just doesn't quite register as a possibility, which makes it easy to them believe that they're not. I mean, imagine the kind of mental leap you have to take. It's like, wait a minute, we're there killing them by the thousands? I mean, this is not because the next step, if you can become convinced that this is a fact, I think people misunderstand. The next step is not going to be, oh yeah, Putin is evil. No, the next step is going to be, oh, he must have reasons for this, because we're in a way complicit in this. We've been doing it, so there must be a reason for this. They're still going to stick with this. So I don't want to I don't even know what an average Russian really means, frankly, in this kind of context. But if I were to guess kind of the prevalent attitude in the country, that would be my prediction.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I guess I don't find it that difficult to believe that that the Russians might think this about the Ukraine war, because you know, when the US invaded Iraq, we convinced ourselves that they wanted us to, and that they would welcome us as liberators. And I think countries generally that's generally speaking are very capable of doing that on a population level. And so I always find this sort of question of what the population thinks when it comes to war and peace. Yeah, I mean, I want to say it's infinitely malleable, but I think leaders, not just of authoritarian states, but democratic states, have a lot of capacity to use the passions of war to manipulate public opinion and to manipulate patriotism. And I think that they've been very successful at that in Russia, as in other places. And so I don't think that the Russians have a public opinion problem, if that's the sort of intent of the question. And I don't really think it's almost conceivable that the Russians would have a public opinion problem, given their sort of adeptness at manipulating public opinion, and given the sophisticatedness of their repressive apparatus. I mean, democracies can do this. Authoritarian states, I think, are even better at it.
I mean, I'll just to illustrate how effective this is. Like, I have trouble persuading my dad of, to disavow, to not believe the Russian version. And my dad, has access to all the sources of information. He has access to a son who's been doing this for 25 years, basically. It matters not a bit
Where does he live?
He lives in Sofia, in Bulgaria. But I mean, I lived in Kiev. We spent 4 years there. So he knows a lot of people in Ukraine, a lot of people in Russia. And his version is not the one that, I have of reality. Unfortunately, this it's not just propaganda. I mean, the propaganda is very smart because it uses, 15, 20% truth in their lies. They just stitch them together in a way that makes sense. And it's extremely effective. But as I just want to point out, there's also the motivation to believe it. And I think that's my dad's problem as well. He just wants to not believe bad things about the Russian government. It's very difficult to overcome.
I don't know if it makes you feel any better, but I have relatives who are Trump voters, so we have.
It's the exact same thing. No, it's the exact same thing. The exact same thing. You just can't. It's a different reality. Yeah.
I want to ask Jan Panek. He had a couple of questions, and I think we're gonna probably wrap it up soon after that.
Thank you, Jamie, and many thanks to both Jeremy and Branislav. First of all, hello to everybody. I think this is SAIS at its best, right? It reminds me, I know we are more than 2 hours into the debate, but that reminds me of the long nights in Bologna and actually in DC as well, discussing whatever. I think it was Ross Perot at that time and Bill Clinton's victory, which were obviously much happier topics for discussion than something like war. But nevertheless, I think this is fantastic demonstration of how the SAIS community functions, even quarter century after graduation, maybe more. So I hope, Branislav, that we can adopt you as an honorary SAISer, at least for the occasion of this evening, and that you will not mind. Well, I had a question, precisely what Branislav was actually commenting on, about the importance of the public indignation in the first days of the invasion, and how that actually drove West to a much more active response. Because I was actually quite astonished seeing the German Chancellor 3 days in after the first weekend, and that weekend actually saw a lot of demonstrations in Germany, right? Very often actually populated by the Eastern Europeans living in Germany. But anyway, I think that question has been dealt with. But my question really is, so what's next for Ukraine? What is our end game plan? Because I think George Kennan was quoted by one of you in the beginning, and indeed he made a lot of very pertinent observations about Russia back in the 1940s, but I think they are still valid. He said that the Russians will never feel secure until they make everybody around them feel insecure. He was also saying that they have this combined attitude to the West, where they regard the West with fascination and at the same time complex of inferiority. So, and then Jeremy spoke about the importance of, you know, not having the dream of attempting or achieving regime change, contrary to what Indrek would love to see, and maybe some others of us here as well, that this ain't gonna happen. We just need to find a way of actually settling with him and letting him live without actually disturbing our life. So where would that leave Ukraine? Because that almost sounds like giving up on them and making them some sort of a buffer zone, right? Some sort of neutrality, Finlandization of Ukraine, as opposed to the grandiose plans and ambitions of Ukraine becoming member of NATO and the EU, which some others would advocate or seem to advocate. And we have seen actually how much the EU cohesion has suffered. Well, not suffered, but how much the EU, no, that's the wrong word, especially from me coming from Eastern Europe, but how much the EU cohesion has changed after countries like mine or Branislav's have entered the EU. And now imagine a place like Ukraine. Will that actually leave EU the same? Can EU actually afford having Ukraine as its member ever in the future? So where does this all leaves us, or where does this all actually leaves Ukrainians in terms of their destiny? I mean, they are now fighting like hell. Hopefully they will secure independence for their country, for their kids. And then, okay, what can they tell their kids? What's your destiny, kids, here in this country? Realistically.
I was told that the questions would be easier than this.
Well, it's the end, right? So why not do the tough one at the end?
Look, first I want to say that it is great to be back in a SAIS crowd, and I have to say, listening to what you just said, that it is one of the great regrets of my life that I never went to SAIS Bologna. I was in Washington. All you guys showed up from Bologna and basically told me how you'd spent the previous year drinking cappuccino and having sex with each other, and I was like, I just spent the last year in the library.
If only cappuccino. If only cappuccino, Jeremy. You missed much more.
Okay. I was thinking that sounded fantastic because I really love cappuccino. But anyway, I'm glad that I'm finally, into that aspect of the club. And I will expect some, cappuccino.
We can make you an honorary member, Jeremy, after this.
Oh, thank you. Does that come with cappuccino? Anyway,
I really love cappuccino.
Yeah.
Yeah, but only for the cappuccino, not the rest.
In terms of what's next for Ukraine, look, I mean, I think that's a question we've been trying to grapple with, but haven't gotten too far. I have put forward the idea that the West doesn't have the power in the absence of changing the regime in Russia, which is a very dangerous proposition, to stabilize Ukraine without Russian participation, and that therefore we should not make the perfect the enemy of the livable, and attempt to find some sort of neutralization. And I know that that's an incredibly unpopular view. It was unpopular before February 24th. Now it's almost heresy. But I think that if we don't do something like that, we will fight possibly many, we won't really, the Ukrainians will, a many-year losing battle against the Russians that will destroy most of their country and most of their cities. And I think that is not a favor to Ukraine, and it is not a favor to the West to take the kind of risks that would be necessary in supporting them in that endeavor. Even though, as was pointed out, they clearly want to do it. It's specifically because, and the reason I say something like that, which no one wants to hear, is because I think that I haven't heard another plan besides regime change in Russia for an end state for Ukraine. And I think, and I can't come up with one. You know, sort of letting the Russians destroy it and then rebuilding it just doesn't really seem like a great idea.
So I think, again, I want to underscore first the fact that a lot of this depends on the Ukrainians themselves, that we can't really decide for them, and neither should we. But any solution that involves Russian troops remaining in Ukraine should basically be a non-starter. That is just means they will come back again and again. We cannot, like, again, maybe I'm speaking too much as a Bulgarian here. We simply cannot abandon Ukraine in this. I can't imagine a neutrality.
What if we don't? What is the end state?
Yes, so the end state that, like, I would imagine is neutrality for Ukraine, yes. Sure, promise not to join NATO, sure. Autonomy, not independence, for the eastern parts. So they're just under Kiev's control. If the Russians still claim that they're concerned with, you know, phantom genocide and whatever they claim is happening there, we'll put an international force, like a peacekeeping force of a sort, to monitor it. They're not meant to fight Russians or anything like this, but just to make it hard to manufacture these things. Unfortunately, all of this is predicated on the Russians suffering a lot more defeats than they currently are. I would also see, and this is what I said at the time when they took Crimea, is they should write off Crimea. The Ukraine will not get it back. So perhaps making officially Crimea Russian, even to the point of giving them a land bridge there, are things that should be on the table, frankly.
Okay, well, we're not that far off then. Because you're talking about leaving Russian troops, I suppose, then in those areas, in Crimea and in...
Well, that would be Russian territory, yes.
Yeah, that's roughly where I was going to.
But I don't think the Ukrainians are there.
No, certainly not. But I do think that you underestimate the degree of control that we have. I think you said earlier that we probably won't use that control for our own political reasons. So I sort of agree. But I think abstracting from our public opinion, we actually do have that kind of leverage.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can stop supplying weapons and it will all be basically guerrilla warfare from then on.
That's my point, yeah.
Yeah, which we can't. And again, it even pains me to say this because, like, my preferred outcome would be go back to the pre-war kind of situation where the Russians just leave. And then we kick the can down the road about Crimea and, you know, kind of remains there and they claim it, but nobody recognizes it. But perhaps that's not an option. And again, the calculation here is how many Ukrainians will die. I am worried about this. I'm not afraid of confronting, in that sense, Russia militarily, in the sense that we can prevail if push comes to shove. But the suffering that this might inflict on the region is just unfathomable.
Gianfranco.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone and leave one final question, moving away a bit from what should happen and what would be ideal, and maybe the absence of really, less, devastating final outcomes for Ukraine. And suffering. It's really more about based on your experience, what do you think would have to happen today in order for Putin to decide to escalate, in order to try to de-escalate the conflict? More trying to look into your crystal ball, which I know is unfair, but it'd be interesting to hear your perspective. And then what would have to happen for the U.S., or rather the West, really, to actually get involved more visibly in the conflict? So, what forces an escalation, and then what would trigger the U.S. or the West to come into the conflict?
My personal feeling is that it's more dangerous to Putin to escalate than to us, frankly. It's in this manner. I mean, everybody discusses, well, he has the finger on the nuke and stuff like this, but you know, NATO is a nuclear power too, very much capable, as with tactical nukes as well. We're not talking about immediately strategic nuclear war, global winter, or anything like this. But we have the precision weapons. The stuff we've done in the past is you attack the places that they were launched from to demonstrate, you know, to don't do this and kind of stuff. The Russians know this. I don't want to sound flippant. I said the nuclear option is a possibility. So are chemical weapons. I don't think we should be afraid of that in the sense like, oh my God, we can't do anything about it to help Ukraine. So what they're trying to organize now, which is a kind of not an airlift, but a corridor to Mariupol and things like this, these are things that we should be doing. But
Yeah,
again, no crystal ball. I don't know what circumstances might trigger unless the Russian army is about to collapse or something.
I think that it's clear that neither side wants to escalate for a variety of reasons. So something would have to change, I think, for either side to escalate. There's always the possibility of accidental escalation, but I'm actually not that worried about that in this case. I think these militaries have a great deal of familiarity and capacity for communication, and so accidental escalation is unlikely. But I guess I think that on the Russian side, as I think I've already said, the escalation against NATO only happens if they think that NATO is intervening already or is about to intervene as a preemption. And that for them would be, you know, a disaster, but I think they would have no choice but to escalate at that moment. I think that that's not impossible because, as we said, they're very suspicious of Russian intervention, of NATO intervention, and they have gotten themselves into a situation where they're incredibly vulnerable to it. So that's the scenario that most frightens me. From the Western side, in terms of escalation, I guess if we meet, it's a little bit difficult on the Western side to exactly know what we're talking about here. And I guess what I'm observing is certain of the Western allies that want to escalate are attempting to sort of create facts on the ground for that, which is a little bit frightening. So I think the alliance will kind of never make this decision. But, you know, the Poles at the NATO summit the other day proposed a peacekeeping force. Their peacekeeping force was not intended to go in after the settlement. Their peacekeeping force was intended to be a international military force consisting of NATO allies and others that would enter Ukraine immediately in order to keep the peace, which there was no peace to keep. So obviously, this would be seen by the Russians or anybody, frankly, as intervention into the war. It was a almost Orwellian proposal to call that a peacekeeping force. And I think that gives you, and I mean, the Americans didn't fall for that, obviously. And the Western Europeans aren't interested in it either. And I think there are about, you know, I think Poland and I think all of the Baltic states and probably Romania are interested in some very serious escalation options that the rest of the alliance, by and large, is not interested in. So I think you'll see there being some efforts to particularly use Russian atrocities to exercise those options. And so that's why, in some sense, chemical weapons, which to my mind aren't a weapon of mass destruction and aren't really very battlefield effective, but they are certainly an atrocity, could have the impact of really changing Western public opinion about escalation and could give the options, particularly the Polish government, which will be sort of insisting on that moment that a red line had been crossed and insisting that Biden had promised to intervene at that moment. So I guess those are scenarios that most concern me.
Guys, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, Jeremy and Branislav. Very, very interesting conversation, and I am sure we will invite you back if you're willing to join us. It doesn't have to be 2.5 hours though. We can make it finite. But it's been really a great conversation, and we thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It was great to see you
thanks.
guys.
It was great to be here. Yeah.
So I'm not kicking anyone out, but you guys are released. You want to say that?
Indrek had his hand up.
Oh, Indrek, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to thank you. It was very enjoyable time to spend here with you, and just let's continue the business as usual. The West is going to fight for its freedom until the last Ukrainian dies. Okay?
I hope not. I hope you're wrong again, because our assessment of what Putin is after is directly proportional to how much your country suffered under Russian domination. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
So
You're correct.
you and I are very sensitive and extremely unhappy with the limited options that seem to be being discussed.
Yeah, but we have next week. We will discuss it again.
Yes. But I think if you ask the people on the periphery of Russia, people like us, and we're again a specific sample. Again, I don't live in Bulgaria. There's a reason for that. Because I can't stand its policies, frankly. It's part of one of the reasons, but that's a different story. But anyway, so I hope that we don't just blab about freedoms the way we sometimes do, but take this seriously. I think that is we should not treat this as just another conflict, because it isn't.
Okay, I'm willing to close with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Thanks
much. It was really
Awesome.
wonderful. Appreciate it.
Oh, good.
Thanks a lot, guys. This is great.
Thank you very much. Very
Thanks.
interesting.
Good to see you again, Jeremy, after all these years.
Yeah, it's really nice. Good to see you, Chris.
And
Bye.
Branislav, thank you. You're excellent, both of you.
Thanks.
Both of you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
guys.
Jamie, thanks for moderating. Good job.
Yeah,
Thanks. That was
great.
good.
And thanks for organizing, Jamie.
Pleasure. That was great.
That was depressing.
Depressing is, well, the invasions are always kind of depressing.
Yeah.
Really good.
Hi, Kate.
Enjoyed it. Hey,
And there's
was
Richard
good.
and Andrea.
Haruko's probably asleep. It's 2:30 in the morning.
crazy.
Haruko,
I'm
you
gonna
there?
make an early dinner. See you guys later.
Bye, Kate.
See you, Kate.
Yeah.
Good to see you all guys, all logged in. Okay. I guess we probably either start another conversation or we should all say goodbye.
I'm
I think
reading off.
goodbye's
Thanks,
good.
everybody. Thanks, Jamie. It was great.
Everybody turned on their
All the best
cameras.
to
Now we
you.
want to stay on. Okay.
See you
Yeah.
guys.
Good to see you all.
Jamie, I've never seen you that well dressed that early in the morning.
I'm wearing shorts.
That's because we did this an hour later. Oh.
Oh, darn, I recorded that.
That's 2 years of working from home.
I do that every day.
See you guys. Really miss you all.
Bye.
We'll
Wolfgang.
get another one going here pretty soon.
Oops.
Wolfgang, got to think of the next topic. What's the next invasion? Jamie?
Well, I mean, there was something on the
Ooh.
plan with
Mm.
we're doing with Andrea, something about university and university networks. But let's see how appropriate this is at the moment. But I'll talk to him and we'll discuss it, and then we'll see